The chamber was quiet enough to hear the faint shuffle of papers, yet thick with tension, when Justice William Alsup leaned back in his chair. His lips curled into a grin, not warm, not amused, but the kind of grin that dismisses. It wasn't just directed at Jasmine Crockett's words, it was aimed at her very presence, as if to say, "You don't belong here. You don't carry the weight to challenge me." Crockett continued, steady and precise, laying out her argument with the sharp clarity of someone who had carried these truths far too long to be shaken now. But Alsup's grin lingered, spreading across his face like a shadow of entitlement. In that small expression, decades of systemic silencing were distilled. The arrogance of power, the casual belittlement of voices deemed inconvenient, the smirk of a man who believed he had already won before the fight began. The audience noticed. A ripple moved through the room, raised eyebrows, murmurs under breaths, the kind of quiet outrage that doesn't erupt but festers, waiting for a spark. Crockett saw it too. She paused, just for a heartbeat, her eyes locking on Alsup's. The grin, frozen on his face, dared her to keep going. And then she did. With a voice sharpened not by anger, but by conviction, Crockett broke the silence. Her words cut through the air with surgical precision, slicing past the smug smile that had been meant to diminish her. What she said wasn't shouted, wasn't forced. It was deliberate, dignified, undeniable. The room shifted, the grin faltered. The balance of power had cracked. For a moment, the chamber no longer belonged to Alsup or the weight of his robe. It belonged to the truth that Crockett had unleashed. Truth wrapped in fire, in history, in unshakable dignity. Gasps echoed, a few claps slipped past protocol before being stifled. Even those who had come expecting another routine display of power felt something shift. This was no longer business as usual. This was a confrontation that dared to redraw the lines. And yet, as powerful as that moment was, it was only the beginning. Because if a single sentence could unravel a grin, what would happen when the real clash began? And that was the question hanging in the air, heavy, electric. How far would this battle go? In the hierarchy of American power, few symbols loom larger than the robe of a federal judge. William Alsup wore his with the ease of someone who believed the position itself was unassailable, that the law bent to his interpretation, and that challengers should bow to his authority. To him, a grin was enough, silent, dismissive, dripping with condescension. It wasn't merely a personal quirk, it was the embodiment of an institution that too often smirked at those who dared to demand justice from the margins. Jasmine Crockett, standing at that podium, was more than a congresswoman defending a point. She was the voice of countless people who had seen that same grin in classrooms, workplaces, courtrooms, anywhere power thought it could silence truth by belittling it. Every syllable she spoke carried the weight of generations who had been told to wait their turn, to keep quiet, to defer to the smirk of privilege. This was why the moment mattered. It wasn't about a single argument or a technicality of law. It was about the clash between arrogance and dignity, between the insulated authority of a judge who thought a grin could shrink his opponent and the defiant fire of a woman who knew her truth was stronger than his posture. The grin became a symbol, replayed in the minds of everyone watching. For some, it triggered anger. How many times had they seen that exact look from someone who thought they were untouchable? For others, it was confirmation of what they already believed, that power wasn't neutral, that justice was not always blind, and that the fight was never fair. And yet, there was Crockett. Not folding, not retreating. Her pause was not hesitation, but calculation. And when she answered, her words carried the rhythm of history, patient, deliberate, unstoppable. This wasn't just a defense, it was a counterstrike. America leaned in, television cameras zoomed closer. Clips began to ripple out live, finding their way to phones, to Twitter feeds, to living rooms across the nation. People asked themselves, can she really turn the tables on him? Can she pierce through the grin of authority and make it mean nothing? The stakes rose with every second, because if she succeeded, it wouldn't just be a personal victory, it would be a statement, a crack in the facade of judicial arrogance, a reminder that even in the most rigid chambers, truth could still break through. But if she failed, the grin would become a weapon, replayed endlessly as proof that power always wins. And so the room sat suspended between those two outcomes, the air thick with anticipation, the cameras waiting for either collapse or triumph. What happened next would decide more than the outcome of an argument. It would decide whether this confrontation faded into obscurity or ignited something far larger. But the moment that followed would turn a courtroom exchange into a cultural flashpoint. For decades, Justice William Alsup carved out a place for himself in the American judiciary as a figure both respected and feared. His rulings were sharp, his questions in court relentless, and his command of legal precedent undeniable. To many, he represented the stern intellect of the bench, a man who could dismantle arguments with surgical precision. But beneath that reputation lay another, whispered among attorneys and quietly acknowledged by those who had stood before him. Alsup did not just wield intellect, he often weaponized it with smug superiority. Colleagues recalled moments in which his brilliance seemed inseparable from his arrogance. He had a way of leaning back, tilting his head, and letting silence hang in the air, as if to remind his opponent that their words were beneath him. It was not enough for him to win an argument, he had to belittle the one who dared present it. His courtroom became less a forum for justice and more an arena where his authority could be flexed. There were infamous instances that lawyers remembered long after their cases had ended. The young attorney, barely 2 years out of law school, once made the mistake of citing a case incorrectly. Alsup didn't just correct her, he chuckled, shook his head, and remarked for the record, "Counsel, perhaps next time you'll review the basics before wasting our time?" The words lingered like a scar. Another advocate, seasoned and confident, tried challenging him on a procedural point, only to be cut off mid-sentence with a dismissive wave. "We won't need theaters here," Alsup said, the corner of his mouth lifting in that grin, half amusement, half dismissal. It was a pattern. His sharpness had long since crossed the line into condescension, and those who left his courtroom carried not only the sting of defeat, but the humiliation of being belittled. To the public, these flashes of arrogance were rare glimpses, filtered through transcripts or snippets of video. But to those who had faced him directly, they were unforgettable. Over the years, Alsup came to embody the archetype of entrenched power. He was not a man easily rattled, nor one accustomed to being challenged in ways that pierced his armor. The robe gave him insulation, the institution gave him authority, and his intellect gave him the confidence to believe he was always the sharpest mind in the room. To him, every smirk, every chuckle, every cutting remark was not just personal habit, it was proof of dominance. But arrogance, when repeated often enough, takes on a life of its own. It becomes more than confidence, it becomes blindness. For Alsup, the grin was not just an expression, It was his trademark, a weapon of dismissal he had relied on for years. Yet, in relying on it, he underestimated its corrosive power. What he thought was a gesture of superiority was, to his opponents and observers, a symbol of everything they despised, the sneer of unchecked authority, the smile of someone convinced the game was rigged in their favor. This is where his villainy becomes clear, not in the rulings themselves, nor even in the intellect that guided them, but in the contempt he projected toward those who dared to stand on equal footing. To him, courtroom debates were not battles of principle, but reminders of hierarchy, his hierarchy. And so, when Jasmine Crockett stood before him, the stage was already set. She was not just debating a point of law, she was confronting the full weight of a man whose entire career had been defined by silencing, dismissing, and diminishing. Every lawyer who had ever been waved off, every advocate who had been made to feel small, every observer who had recognized the smug grin of power, they were all present in that room, embodied in her stance. For once, Alsup's familiar weapon faced a new kind of fire. Because the thing Arrogance always forgets is this: mockery may weaken the timid, but it cannot extinguish the determined. And as the grin spread across his face, dismissing her words as though they were nothing more than noise, it carried with it the very flaw that would undo him. Because arrogance carries a flaw, it always forgets to respect the fire it mocks. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in the marbled halls of Congress or the polished chambers of power. It begins in the quiet grit of a household that knew the weight of struggle. The daughter of working-class roots, she grew up seeing what resilience looked like in its rawest form. Bills stretched thin, opportunities often seemed reserved for others, but dignity was never negotiable. From her earliest years, Crockett learned that strength was not about being the loudest in the room. It was about never letting anyone convince you that you didn't belong in it. Those lessons carried her into law school, where the odds seemed stacked against her. She was a young black woman navigating spaces that had long been guarded by the gatekeepers of privilege. Professors who underestimated her intellect, classmates who mistook her confidence for aggression, and institutions that seemed designed to test her at every turn. She faced them all. Where others might have bent under the weight, Crockett used each dismissal as fuel. Every time someone doubted her, she sharpened her mind further. Every time someone tried to diminish her, she amplified her voice. Her legal career began not in plush corporate offices, but in the trenches of defense work, standing between ordinary people and the machinery of a system too often tilted against them. It was here that she developed the blend of sharp legal reasoning and fearless delivery that would become her trademark. She knew how to argue law, yes, but more importantly, she knew how to argue humanity. Judges who dismissed her clients, prosecutors who sneered at her presence, Crockett matched them all with a relentless truth-telling that left no room for condescension. And yet, her rise was never easy. Racism did not fade because she was smart. Sexism did not vanish because she was capable. If anything, the higher she climbed, the more visible the barriers became. There were whispers, too young, too fiery, too unapologetic. There were moments when opponents tried to box her into caricatures, angry, emotional, unpolished. But Crockett understood the trap. She refused to play small. She refused to temper her authenticity for the comfort of those who had always controlled the stage. It was this refusal that propelled her from the courtroom into politics. Elected first at the state level and later to Congress, Crockett carried with her the same fire that had defined her early battles. She didn't trade it for polished diplomacy or rehearsed platitudes. Instead, she brought it into the heart of power, where her voice became a rallying cry for those who felt invisible. To her supporters, she was proof that honesty could survive in Washington. To her critics, she was a thorn, unpredictable, sharp, unwilling to play by the old rules. Her congressional career became a series of showdowns that revealed her unique gift. Where others spoke in rehearsed talking points, she spoke with raw clarity. Where others bent under pressure, she leaned in with defiance. Time and again, she dismantled opponents not just with facts, but with a delivery that struck at the core of their arrogance. She wasn't merely debating policy, she was exposing the deeper truth of power, privilege, and the way both had long silenced voices like hers. That combination, sharp legal mind and fearless authenticity, made her a rare figure in American politics. She wasn't the polished diplomat or the backroom deal-maker. She was the teacher who refused to let the classroom bully win. She was the reminder that dignity does not ask for permission, it commands respect. And so when she walked into Justice William Alsup's courtroom, she carried more than legal arguments. She carried the weight of every battle she had fought against being underestimated. She carried the voices of those who had been silenced by sneers and grins. She carried the knowledge that her presence alone was already a defiance of the hierarchy that had long defined the space. For Crockett, this wasn't just another case. It was a continuation of her life's work, standing tall in the face of dismissal, refusing to let arrogance define the terms of the conversation. She knew the game Alsup played. She had seen it before, from professors who doubted her to colleagues who rolled their eyes. She recognized the grin not as charm, but weapon. And unlike so many before her, she was not intimidated by it. Her preparation was not only in the documents and arguments she carried, it was in the years of being told she was too much, the nights she had to prove herself twice over, the endless cycle of fighting for respect in rooms that were never built for her to enter. That was her real arsenal. And when she stood across from Alsup, meeting his eyes as that familiar grin spread across his face, she did not flinch, she did not shrink, because Crockett understood something fundamental. Arrogance may look like strength, but it is always brittle. It hides behind gestures and smirks because it fears being exposed. The room may have thought they were about to see another young black woman silenced by a powerful judge, but Crockett knew better. She had lived this story too many times to misread it now. So when Alsup grinned, thinking he had the upper hand, Crockett was already sharpening her blade. The courtroom felt charged, as if the air itself had thickened. Justice William Alsup leaned forward, that trademark grin tugging at the corners of his mouth, and interrupted mid-sentence. His tone dripped with authority, the kind sharpened over decades on the bench. Each interjection came not as a question, but as a performance, meant less to clarify and more to remind everyone of who held the gavel. "Counselor, are you sure you want to make that argument?" he asked, smirk widening, voice carrying a mix of condescension and amusement. Crockett did not flinch. She stood steady, letting his words echo. Her silence, unnerving in its composure, seemed to invite him to continue. And continue he did. Each interruption stacked upon the last, the grin growing bolder, his dismissiveness spilling into open derision. At one point he chuckled, a sound that cut through the chamber like a blade. "You see, Congresswoman, this is where passion too often outruns reason." His words drew a few polite chuckles from the gallery, but the reaction was mixed. Some shifted uncomfortably, sensing the imbalance, the arrogance on display. Crockett's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't break. She knew what was happening. She had been here before, in classrooms, in courtrooms, and political debates where those with power mistook silence for weakness. She let him dig deeper, let him stretch the rope of his own performance. Online, the imagined audience was already stirring. Comment sections and live tweets burst with reactions. Did he just laugh at her? This is uncomfortable. She's letting him cook his own downfall. The digital hum mirrored the murmurs that were beginning to ripple through the chamber itself. Alsup pressed on, sensing what he believed was momentum. He dismissed her point, reframed her argument with a mocking twist, and leaned back as if savoring the moment. This isn't about dignity, Ms. Crockett. It's about the law, and the law is clear. His words hung heavy, intended as a final blow, a silencing stroke from the bench. But in the silence that followed, something shifted. Crockett stood perfectly still, her hands resting calmly, her face unreadable. The longer she waited, the more his grin seemed to lose its shine. The murmurs grew louder, not in his favor, but against him. The gallery's laughter had soured into unease. Online, the tide turned. She hasn't even spoken yet, and she's already winning. Watch his face. It's arrogance turning into desperation. She gave him space, gave him rope, gave him enough time to believe he had cornered her completely. The courtroom, once filled with the sound of his voice, now throbbed with anticipation. Every second of her silence was a rebuttal in itself, a reminder that power does not always belong to the loudest in the room. And then, just as his grin flickered under the weight of the stillness, Crockett lifted her chin. The air tightened, the silence fractured. Then came the moment when her silence ended and his grin vanished. The chamber hung in silence, every eye fixed on Jasmine Crockett. For several long seconds, she did nothing. No fidgeting, no shifting papers, no defensive stammering. She simply stood, letting Justice Alsup's words hang in the stale courtroom air like smoke from a match that had just burned out. His grin, once gleaming with smug certainty, began to falter under the weight of her stillness. Then, with a voice low but razor-sharp, she spoke. Justice Alsup, the law may be clear to those who've always stood above it, but to the people I represent, clarity looks different. It looks like struggle. It looks like voices ignored. It looks like a system that grins at them, just as you are grinning at me now, and tells them their truth is just too loud. The gallery stirred, soft gasps, the faint murmur of recognition. It was not a shout, not a rant. It was precise, deliberate, the kind of rebuttal that slides under armor before anyone notices the blade. Alsup leaned back, blinked once, twice. His lips twitched as if to retort, but Crockett wasn't finished. She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. You call this passion outrunning reason? No, Justice. This is passion forcing reason to face itself. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe, just maybe, that's the point. The room shifted. The smirk that had animated Alsup moments earlier was gone, replaced by a taut jaw and the faintest flicker of unease. His composure, once unshakable, now cracked at the edges. Crockett paused, letting the silence build again. Timing was everything, and she wielded it like a weapon. She scanned the chamber deliberately, as though to remind everyone, audience, press, even the judge himself, that this moment wasn't just about her, it was about all those who had been dismissed with the same grin, all those whose words had been cut off mid-sentence. Then she delivered the line that detonated in the room like thunder. You can grin at me, Justice Alsup, but history doesn't grin back. It keeps receipts. The gallery erupted. Gasps mixed with bursts of laughter, a ripple of applause breaking past courtroom decorum. Even the bailiff looked caught between order and awe. Online, the reaction was instantaneous. The imagined captions appeared like neon in the minds of millions. Hashtag Crockett keeps receipts. Hashtag Alsup exposed. Alsup raised a hand as if to rein in the noise, but his voice cracked slightly when he finally spoke. "Congresswoman, that kind of rhetoric—" Crockett cut him off, but not with volume, with poise. "That kind of rhetoric, Justice, is called truth, and it belongs to more than the man with the gavel." Another wave swept through the chamber. Laughter, applause, cheers muffled behind hands. The divide was stark. Alsup's authority shrinking by the second, and Crockett's presence expanding until it filled the room. His grin had vanished entirely now. His eyes darted between the gallery, the clerks, the press, and finally back to her. For the first time, William Alsup looked unsettled. His trademark sharpness no longer landed. It glanced off her composure like sparks against steel. Crockett, sensing the shift, eased back slightly, not retreating, but claiming space. She allowed a glimmer of humor into her tone, enough to sting without cruelty. "I've been underestimated my whole life, Justice. They called me too loud, too direct, too much. Funny how those labels always come from people who have the microphone. Yet, here I stand, still too much, still here. And I'll be here long after your grin fades from memory." The chamber cracked wide open. Applause, cheers, even some standing. Decorum shredded by the force of her words. Cameras flashed, pens scratched furiously. Online, the moment was already looping, already turning into memes, already breaking out of the chamber and into living rooms, feeds, and news tickers. Alsup shifted in his chair, his hand tightening around the gavel. The grin was gone, replaced with something raw, a shadow of anger, a hint of panic. His mask of superiority, so carefully cultivated over decades, was slipping in real time before the eyes of America. Crockett, calm as ever, didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every pause was a spotlight. Every sentence was a strike. And every look into the gallery was a reminder she was not alone. The tension broke entirely when she leaned just slightly forward, her voice dropping to a tone so intimate it felt like a whisper carried on a storm. "This isn't about me, Justice. This is about every person who's been silenced by a smirk, every community written off by a dismissive laugh. You think I came here to argue with you? I came here to show them that silence doesn't last forever." The gallery thundered. Some clapped, some shouted, some simply gasped. For once, it was not the judge commanding order, it was Crockett commanding history. Alsup lifted his gavel, tapping once, twice, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of validation flooding the chamber. His composure was gone, his face reddening, his eyes darting. The grin, once his weapon, had become his ruin. Crockett, satisfied, let the storm crest. Then, with perfect timing, she drew the energy back into one final, devastating line. "You can try to laugh me off, Justice, but the truth doesn't need a smile to be heard. It only needs a voice, and I am that voice today." The room erupted again, louder than before, drowning out the gavel's frantic taps. Online, the clip was already viral in spirit, if not yet in reality. The hashtags wrote themselves, the edits were already being imagined, the soundbite destined to loop endlessly across platforms. And as Alsup sat there, visibly rattled, his authority diminished not by shouting, but by dignity, one thing was certain: the balance of power had shifted. But what neither of them knew was how far this moment would ripple beyond the room. It took less than 5 minutes for the clip to hit Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. By the end of the hour, it had exploded across every corner of the internet. What began as a single courtroom exchange was now a cultural wildfire. The hashtags told the story in real time. Hashtag Crockett shuts down surged to the top of trending lists, followed by hashtag Alsup Grin gone, hashtag Receipts Matter, and a flood of others born from her searing words. Within hours, millions had watched the moment Alsup's grin dissolved under Crockett's reply. TikTok users remixed it into punchy 15-second edits, splicing the grin and the takedown into dance tracks, reaction memes, and dramatic slow-motion replays. On Instagram Reels, creators captioned the clip with lines like, "When the teacher finally schools the principal," and "This is how dignity wins." Twitter lit up with GIFs, looping Alsup's grin fading into silence, paired with Crockett's line, "History doesn't grin back, it keeps receipts." The late-night comedy shows wasted no time. Monologues opened with split-screen stills. Alsup's grin on one side, Crockett's fire-hardened stare on the other. The punchline was simple, sharp, and devastating. When your poker face loses to the truth. Laughter echoed from living rooms across America. But the ripple didn't stop with entertainment. Commentators who usually dismissed Crockett were suddenly forced to acknowledge what everyone had seen: control, composure, command. Even a few conservative voices, grudgingly, admitted that the Congresswoman had landed the blow of the night. One analyst muttered through gritted teeth on cable news, "You may not like her politics, but that was surgical." For her supporters, the moment was electric. It wasn't just about watching her dismantle a judge's smugness. It was about validation. Seeing someone who looked like them, who carried their frustrations, stand her ground and win. Across group chats and community centers, the line, "Silence doesn't last forever," became more than a quote. It became a rallying cry. Mothers shared it with their daughters, teachers with their students, organizers with their communities. The pride was palpable, and for once, the people who so often felt dismissed saw themselves mirrored in victory. The memes kept multiplying. A viral TikTok cut Alsup's fading grin next to the words, "Error, confidence not found." Another re-edited the scene like a boxing match, with Crockett's counterattack timed to the bell. On YouTube, creators spliced it into montages of top 10 mic drops in politics, already racking up millions of views. And then came the think pieces. Op-eds in national papers framed it as more than a courtroom quarrel. They cast it as a generational clash, a test of dignity versus arrogance. Crockett reminded America, one columnist wrote, that calm truth can disarm the sharpest smirk. Blogs lit up with titles like "The Day the Grin Died" and "Why Jasmine Crockett's Words Echoed Beyond the Chamber." Even within legal circles, murmurs spread. Was Alsup losing his grip on the authority he once wielded effortlessly? Had his arrogance finally crossed into caricature? Law students clipped the exchange for study groups, labeling it a masterclass in rhetorical timing. But what made the moment truly seismic wasn't just the commentary or the comedy. It was the collective feeling it stirred. People across the country felt like they'd witnessed a crack in the old order, a glimpse of what it meant when power was confronted not with fear, but with fearless clarity. The pride swelled beyond party lines, threading into the deeper question of what justice should look like. Not grins from above, but voices rising from below. And as the internet roared, something became clear. This wasn't just a courtroom clip. It was a mirror, a reflection of America's ongoing struggle between arrogance and dignity, between silence and speech, between those who mock and those who refuse to be mocked. This wasn't just a debate, it became a mirror for America. In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett refused to let the moment be reduced to a meme or a fleeting internet clip. Standing before microphones, she reframed the exchange with a clarity that cut deeper than any joke could. To her, Alsup's grin wasn't just a personal slight. It was a symbol, the smirk of power that believes it can dismiss, diminish, and silence voices it deems unworthy. She reminded America that arrogance has many faces. Sometimes it comes in the form of words, loud and hostile. Other times it hides in something smaller, a raised eyebrow, a laugh at the wrong time, a grin meant to humiliate. But beneath every gesture lies the same message: you don't matter. Crockett refused to accept that message. With her reply, she showed that dignity doesn't need to shout, doesn't need to mock, doesn't need to match arrogance blow for blow. Dignity wins by standing firm, by letting truth cut deeper than the sharpest smirk. When arrogance smirks, she told a rally days later, dignity doesn't have to raise its voice. It just has to stand. The words resonated far beyond the courtroom walls. For students who felt silenced in classrooms, for workers brushed aside by bosses, for communities dismissed by those in power, her response became a reminder: silence is not the same as defeat. A pause can carry more weight than a torrent of noise. And when the moment comes, truth spoken with clarity can shake the ground under arrogance. She tied her message back to something universal: the everyday battles people fight for respect. A mother challenging a system that overlooks her child. A worker standing up for fair treatment. A young activist daring to speak truth to institutions that would rather grin and wave them away. Each moment, no matter how small, carries the same power. Crockett's lesson was not just about her versus Alsup. It was about all of us versus the grin that says you don't belong here. Her moment reminded the nation that resilience matters more than mockery, that courage outweighs arrogance, and that history remembers those who stood their ground with quiet fire. And as her words echoed through communities and headlines, the story sharpened into something larger than politics. It became a parable about justice itself. Arrogance may believe it has the last laugh, but dignity does not bend. Dignity listens, learns, and then speaks. And when it does, the grin vanishes. The crescendo of her message was simple but unforgettable. A smirk fades, but courage endures. And with that, the nation understood. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just a moment. It was a lesson in how truth, spoken with calm conviction, will always outlast the arrogance that tries to silence it. One grin, one reply, one unforgettable shutdown. That was all it took for Jasmine Crockett to transform a moment of condescension into a defining clash of dignity versus arrogance. Justice William Alsup thought a smirk would silence her, but instead it became the spark that ignited her fiercest reply. A reply that left the room stunned and the nation talking. This wasn't just courtroom drama. It was a reminder of something deeper. When arrogance tries to mock, dignity can still stand tall. Crockett didn't need to shout, didn't need to match arrogance with arrogance. She let her truth cut through the noise, and in doing so, she showed millions that respect isn't granted by the powerful. It's claimed by those who refuse to be dismissed. Her moment was more than a comeback. It was a call for all of us to face the smirks, the dismissals, the everyday ways people are told they don't belong, and answer them with resilience, courage, and clarity. And that's why we share stories like this, because they aren't just entertainment. They're reminders of what's possible when dignity refuses to bend. So, if this moment moved you, if it reminded you of the power of standing tall when arrogance tries to push you down, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who needs that reminder. Be part of a community that believes truth is louder than mockery, and dignity stronger than arrogance. Because the fight for respect doesn't end in one courtroom. It begins with all of us.